All right, that's excellent. We, of course, looked at chapters 1 through 10, and chapter 11 through chapter 30 are mostly topical. That's probably the best way to study those. And so you could look at a lot of topics there, and some of you kind of touched on those topics already. But we're going to pick up in Proverbs chapter 31 today now. Proverbs chapter 31. And I'm going to dwell primarily on the virtuous woman of chapter 31. That's starting at verse number 11 and going down through the end of the chapter, verse number 31. A total of 22 verses. 22 verses that we'll look at here. I'm sorry, 10 through 31. Verses 10 through 31 of chapter 31. Of course, this this proverb is, I'll talk about some psalms, that's why the word's in my head, but this proverb is about a prophecy that the mother of Solomon, we believe, teaches to her son, the mother being Bathsheba, the son being Lemuel, which is believed to be Solomon, and I'll touch on that, why that is. But so this is a prophecy that was given from a mother to a son. We saw some of the authors. Do you remember some of the authors of the book? Of course, there's Solomon. There's also Agur, as found in chapter 30. The words of Agur, the son of Jacob. Who are some others that we mentioned? Chapter 25, verse 1. These are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied out. So they had gathered and compiled some Proverbs and put them together, and those are great Proverbs in chapters 25 through 29. Really, really good Proverbs. Tons of nuggets that it'd be great just to memorize those and try to put them to practice, you know, where when one of your children, Rick, when they're growing up, just that quick, you can give them something. There was one just recently, let me think here. He that hath confidence in an unfaithful man. And I don't know exactly where that verse is, but the point is, Proverbs they should just be there automatically. And Edmund didn't do something that I told him to do, and I had depended on him to do it. So we talked about dependability, and we talked about having confidence in an unfaithful man. So I love book of Proverbs, being able to use it. And chapters 25 through 29 are just great verses, lots of little nuggets all over the place. So in chapter 31, of course, most of the chapter deals with the virtuous woman. Not all of it, but the whole thing is a prophecy from the mother of Lemuel to King Lemuel. So whoever that is, and I believe that to be Solomon. We believe, most commentators, if you look that up, they'll say that that's Solomon. This is believed, and the way it's described as is a pet name or a nickname for Solomon. The words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. Verse 2 then, what my son, and what the son of my womb, and what the son of my vows? So that gives us an indication of what his mother, what her love for her son was like. My son, son of my womb, son of my vows. She loved him very, very much. And Solomon, of course, we know from several places that Solomon was very, very close to his mom, Bathsheba. And so this definitely seems to fit that idea. Okay, now, most of the chapter, however, is about the virtuous woman, and it comes in the form of a hidden code, if you will. That's the way I've read that some secular writers, the way they describe it. This is a hidden code in Proverbs. No, it's an acrostic. An acrostic. So if you remember what an acrostic is, in the Hebrew Bible, the writers numerous times used acrostics to get their point across. So let me talk about acrostics a little bit. We'll look at some of these other ones also in Psalm and the book of Psalms and so on. Just some very interesting things. And then I want to dwell on the topic of the virtuous woman as we find it in chapter 31. So first, let's talk about this acrostic. One writer describes this feature of Hebrew writing as this. Quote, a poetic way of saying that a total coverage of the subject was being offered. So a poetic way to cover the entire subject. So if you took any topic, let's say, in this case, he takes the topic of a virtuous woman, Bathsheba, takes the topic of a virtuous woman and describes it 22 different ways. Why 22? That's the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. And, of course, it's the number of verses from chapters 10 through 30, or verse numbers 10 through 31. So they use literally 22 individual proverbs with each succeeding letter of the alphabet, of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, so it's a poetic way of saying that the whole subject is being totally covered. 22 aspects of it. I mean, I'd have a hard time. Think, what if you sat down and you said, I'm going to go through well, some of you can do this because of the schooling that you've had. But if you just had to think of an animal, right, that goes with every letter of the English alphabet, 26, you could do it because you've had, right, your Becca or whatever, AC, whatever it is you've had, you probably have learned, you know, the animals that go with those. But if you hadn't had that, just that alone would be very difficult. Let's take any other example. Let's take, you were going to talk about, well, it's easy to think about a virtuous woman because you're looking for a wife. But think about just any other topic and 26 different ways to describe that topic. When you do that, you're going to totally cover the subject. That's the point. And it's a poetic way of doing that. In the common form of the acrostic found in Old Testament poetry, each line or stanza begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet in order. What's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet? The Aleph. And what's the last one? Tau, I don't know how you say it. T-A-U-ish. It's something like that. So, but it's in order from the Aleph to the end, whatever that word is. This literary form probably was intended as an aid to memory. An aid to memory. Pastor Dameron uses a few short acrostics sometimes in his sermons. Of course, we have a phrase that we use. When you're saying that the entire subject is covered, what you're saying, what way you would use a phrase is everything from A to Z. That's saying the whole thing, everything. And so when you're taking a topic and you're discussing that from with an acrostic, everything from A to Z, the entire discussion of the topic. Let me give you some acrostics throughout the Bible. This is not nearly the only place. Let me just mention to you some of these. Acrostics take place in Psalm 111 and Psalm 112. Psalm 111 and Psalm 112. I'll just mention these and read them real quickly, or a part of it at least. There's 10 verses in Psalm 111. Then how many? 10 more verses in Psalm 112. Each letter begins a line, and without knowing the Hebrew alphabet, I don't know which word it is in that verse that is the first word in the Hebrew alphabet, or the first, or which one belongs in the first word of the acrostic, I mean. But you could look that up. But Psalm 111 and Psalm 112 go together and include almost all, actually, you know what, they do include all of the Hebrew alphabet in the acrostic. Psalm 25, Psalm 34, and Psalm 145. Each letter begins a half verse of the Hebrew, every letter begins a half verse. Then the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So there's an acrostic. 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet are all used there in each of those chapters. In Psalm 37, Lamentations 1, 2, and 4, each letter begins a whole verse. In Lamentations 3, each letter begins 3 verses. So you've heard before that critics said that Lamentations is this weird book that there's really not much of God in there and so on. Well, the book of Lamentations is an unbelievable, beautiful, poetic verse of poetry in Hebrew. And it's all set up in acrostic form. It's an amazing book, even though in English we don't get the effect of it, of course. And then, of course, what's the most famous acrostic in the Bible? Psalm 119. Thank you. And there, in each section of 8 verses, the same opening letter is used, and the 22 sections of Psalm 119 move through the Hebrew alphabet letter after letter. So there's 8 verses per set. It's an amazing, amazing. Think about the amount of work that it would take to develop this according to that acrostic form. So, in Proverbs 31, the initial letters of each verse go through the Hebrew alphabet in order. Hebrew, of course, is not written like our language of English in form from left to right. Well, I'm facing you, so left to right. From left to right, their language, of course, is written backwards, from right to left. So the first letter on the right is the initial letter in each verse. Now, if you had to pick which English word represents or is represented by that first letter or the next letter and so on, the succeeding letter, you'd never get it because I had no clue. As you're going through it, you kind of think the main words, right? And that's not at all the case, because in the English language, of course, we have different words, more words, less words, whatever it might be. And so anyway, it doesn't show up in English at all. Any of you have a Hebrew font on your computer?
Probably, I think so.
Probably. Look that up sometime, and then find a Hebrew concordance or whatever concordance, lexicon, and see if they all fit in line. Of course, I know they will, but look it up and you can see that for yourself. It's pretty interesting. Sometimes it's very helpful for you to know that a certain word in Proverbs 31 is only there for poetic reason. It's not the main word in the proverb, but it's there at the beginning. Well, I point to the left. It should be to the right. It's there at the beginning because that's the first word that represents the letter of the Hebrew alphabet there. Also, here's another thing. In Proverbs 31, each of the Proverbs stand completely alone. So the point is, you know how Paul, in his writings, he develops an argument. So each of the succeeding verses and chapters are building on what just came before it. And that's not at all the way the book of Proverbs, at least Proverbs chapter 31, those are not set up. I read a good way to describe that. The author is not building an argument like Paul does in Romans. Instead, he is stringing pearls. Each verse is a pearl. They're not dependent on the previous one. They're just boom, boom, nuggets of wisdom everywhere. That's a neat way to put it, I think. He set himself the task, as he says in verse number 30. Proverbs chapter 31, look at verse 30. Favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. And so that's a big summary, but he set himself the task to praise the woman who fears the Lord. And piece by piece by piece by piece, nugget after nugget after nugget, he praises the woman who fears the Lord. 22 praiseworthy things to say about this woman. Okay, so before I outline this section, let me give you, and I don't know how you want to do this. I'm really not going to ask you for this. Maybe I should just post it on Schoology or something and give it to you that way. But I thought it was interesting to actually see the words that are the beginning of the Hebrew letter, if you understand what I'm saying. So I have them highlighted in red. Verse number 10, woman, a worthy woman, who can find? Her price is far above rubies, a virtuous woman. The heart of her husband trusteth. In verse 11, trusteth is the second starts with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Doeth in verse 12. Seeketh in verse 13. In verse 14, it's the word she, or it's the word for the reference to the woman. She. In verse 15, it's even more odd. Also, she riseth also, or also she riseth. The word also is the word there. Considereth in verse 16. Girdeth in verse 17. Perceiveth in verse 18. Now those three are pretty obvious. Hands in verse 19. Palms in verse 20. Not in verse 21. She is not afraid of the snow. Now in the English you don't get that. But I'm sure in the Hebrew the word not fits at the beginning of a sentence. For us it does not fit. Not. Verse 22, coverings. 23, known. Known is her husband in the gates. You see, it's all poetic. It would be definitely set up something to that effect. Linen garments. Linen in verse 24. Strength in verse 25. Mouth in verse 26. Looketh in verse 27. Rise up is one word in verse 28 in the Hebrew. Many, many in verse 29. Deceitful in verse 30. And give in verse 31. So those are the words that begin with the successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, so I thought that was interesting. You can find that, but I thought that was pretty interesting. All right, let me talk about the virtuous woman. Let's talk about her. Wonderful passage here. Oops, I got this mixed up. All right, let me divide this into about 7 or 8 categories. And there's a lot of ways you can look at this, and I just took what David Cloud has. I think it's a great description. I have it here, but I have a few. There's more things in the book, of course. Page 240 in your book, if you have that, is 241, actually. It's about the virtuous woman. Proverbs 31, 10 through 31. Let's talk about this virtuous woman. First of all, her value. Verse number 10. Her value. Who can find a virtuous woman, for her price is far above rubies? The writer of Proverbs likes to make comparisons. So earlier in the book we saw that he compares wisdom to gold and I think fine gold as well. There's many comparisons though like that. And here he compares the virtuous woman to way above rubies. He doesn't say how much above, but obviously the point is infinite. I mean, there's nothing more valuable than a virtuous woman. The value of a virtuous woman is much more than precious jewels. She can't be purchased. She can't be bought. And we're not talking about a dowry here. You know, of course, the father of the bride likes this verse. Oh, yeah. How much is a virtuous woman worth? Oh, lots. More than you can pay. But the one who's marrying the daughter, you know, of course he thinks she's valuable, but he doesn't want to have to buy her, pay a big dowry for her. But according to the verse here, well, not according to the verse, sorry. But the answer really is that it only comes from the Lord. The virtuous woman is brought up by parents who are training her, and then the Lord works in her heart. Who can find a virtuous woman? It only comes from the Lord. Chapter 19, verse 14 says that of Proverbs. Proverbs 19:14. House and riches are the inheritance of fathers, and a prudent wife is from the Lord. Hopefully you don't do this with an ulterior motive as you were talking about, but when you're wanting, if you were to want something from someone, especially a wife, from her parents, you would treat them kindly. You would treat them in a specific way. Well, I think it's interesting, according to 1914, if you want a wife, a prudent wife, then get close to the one who can give you one. And that's the Lord. A prudent wife is from the Lord. Her value. Secondly, we also see her dependability. Her dependability. She can be trusted by her husband because her first love is God. And listen, when you have a wife who loves the Lord with all her heart, soul, mind, and strength, you're not going to worry about her. You're not going to say, man, I wonder if she has our family's best interests at heart. Are you kidding? A good wife, that's just natural. That's automatic. When they love the Lord, you can completely trust it. So she's dependable. She makes do with whatever her husband provides. Look at verse 11. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. So the heart of her husband, he gives her what he can, and she makes do with that. They don't need any more. There's no need of spoil. She can live and survive off of what he makes for her. And that's a good wife. She does also good for her husband there. We see that as far as in verse 11. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her. He has no need of spoil. She provides his needs. He doesn't go looking somewhere else. Pastor Lewis, I think, once said, concerning this thing of being happy with his wife, he said, why would I, he said, here I'm eating steak. That's what he said. I'm eating steak. Why would I go get a hot dog? Well, good point. Be happy with the wife of your youth. Her dependability. Third, I want you to see her labor. Verse number 12. Verse 13. She seeketh wool. Wow. She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. What does she do? She's a willing worker. She's a diligent worker. Diligent worker. Well, how important. Now think about this. Let me give you this number. Of the 22 verses describing the woman, 14 of them speak of her labor, her work. 14 of the verses. Let's look down through these and see that a little bit. Verse 13. She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant's ships. She bringeth her food from afar. She riseth also while it is yet night, giveth meat to her household, and all of these are work. She considereth a field and buyeth it. She's planting a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. Keeps right on working. She layeth her hands to this. You get the point. She's working. A good wife works. And, and we get done. When us men, we get done with work, what do? We come home and we sit down. At least that's what I do. We come home and we sit down. And my wife still, she doesn't physically manual labor like I do a lot of times. This isn't manual labor, but anyway, she's not doing what I do. But she's always going, always going. And she doesn't sit down as much as I do in the evenings and so on. She's always going. She has the kids. She has dishes, and so on. Now, as the kids get older, that's going to change a bit. It'll be nice. So her labor, that's a very, very important part of a virtuous woman. Look, don't go after the wife. There's some women who have one good thing about them, or their looks. Whew. If that's all that she has, don't bother. Don't go after her. But when they have a balanced life and they're a hard worker and they're committed and dependable, they're worth. Not just because they're spiritual and that makes them valuable, but they're worth literally to you personally. They're worth more than you need, and that's a huge blessing. Work. One other thing with her labor here is that she's varied. She can do lots of things. I'm still on underneath number 3, her labor. She's willing, she's diligent, she's varied. How dumb. Okay, I know in our day and age, and I've talked about this before, I think even in dorm devotions with the guys and things, but a woman who is, quote unquote, just a housewife. And I've heard ladies and young ladies today say, well, I'm just going to be a housewife because in the old days, they were just housewives and I want to be like they were. No. Housewives in those days were not just housewives. They made soap. They made butter. They milked cows. They planted the garden. You keep going. They washed the dishes by hand. Not dishes, by hand. Yes, the dishes. They washed the laundry by hand. They did everything by hand. They worked. So to be a housewife in the 1800s and to be just a housewife today, changing a diaper, okay, that's just the start. Anyway, you understand the point. I don't want to hear an excuse from a young lady. I just want to be a housewife. No. Be a worker. Be varied. Know how to do. Learn how to do lots and lots of things. I didn't even mention sewing. Think about that. Now what do women do? They go and they shop at the store and they come home. Oh, that was so hard. I was shopping. Okay, why don't you go make the clothes like the housewives used to do? So, this varied woman, man, she's just a worker. Let's see here. She makes clothing. She's feminine. She's modest. She manages her household. She buys fields. She plants fields. She does lots and lots and lots of things. This is a virtuous woman. I want to go off on a rabbit trail. Better not. One writer said, it was customary among the Jews to bring up all the youth to useful and handicraft occupation. In other words, to be able to do lots of things. Because you had to. Okay, let's move on. Her distribution to the poor. Her distribution to the poor. Verse number 20. She stretcheth out her hand to the poor, yea, she reaches forth her hands to the needy. So she's trying to get to them. This isn't a woman who, walking down the street, happens to see a poor person and drops a dollar in their bucket. This woman is stretching out her hands to the needy, offering them her thing, and offering them her help, and food, and so on. She reacheth forth her hands to the needy. Man, that's powerful. A good woman isn't just selfish and wanting to keep everything that she gets and makes. She's willing to share and to help others. I love that. It's a great description of a virtuous woman. Fifth, her wisdom. Her wisdom. There's lots of areas in the book of Proverbs that mention this, of course, with wisdom. But look at verse 30. Favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord. Of course, we know that wisdom is the fear of the Lord. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And this woman doesn't say in the verse 30 that she has wisdom, but it does say she has the fear of the Lord. She shall be praised for this, her wisdom. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 2. Proverbs 15, verse 2. The tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright. This woman knows how to do lots of things. And she uses that wisdom to help others and to be a blessing to her family and so on. Her wisdom. Verse 27 also of the chapter. She looketh well to the ways of her household. Now that doesn't mean that she just gazes at her household. She looketh well. In other words, she looks with wisdom and she sees things and she sees what her family and her husband and her children, what they need. And she says, okay, how can we make this happen? I'm not talking about physical things. I'm talking about everything. A good woman, a virtuous woman, sees things in her. I see that this one child is struggling. Their attitude isn't right. They see things. They notice where their children have needs and their husband and so on. This is a virtuous woman, has wisdom. Her wisdom. Next, her praise. This woman does receive praise. And sometimes it's not, I'm not talking about, a rock and roll concert, where everybody's chanting her name. In fact, that kind of praise is false. Let that person say the wrong thing and that adoring crowd of fans will turn on them in a heartbeat. But a woman like this, not so. And we're not talking about heaping praise. We're talking about real praise, real appreciation. Verse 28, her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Now, think about that verse. And think about the amount of praise that a virtuous woman, gets. Is it a lot or a little? I guess that's a vague question, but it's not much. It's not much, in my opinion. You have your children and your husband. Okay, think about that. To a virtuous woman, that's all she wants. Right? Think about it. The strange woman, what does she want? All the other creeps paying attention to her. And it's false and it's not real. It's for bad reasons. It's for ulterior motives. It's whatever. The virtuous woman, she's happy with the praise of her husband and of her children. That's all she wants. No, I don't mean that's all she wants, but that's all the praise she wants. She's not looking for praise from other men. Man, that is an awesome thought. Okay, so her praise by her children, verse 28 and 29, by her husband, and then also, get this, verse 31, her own works praise her. Verse 31, give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. Think about that. The works that you do, this is true across the board, I believe. The works that we do say something about us. If you do shoddy work, you're not going to get praise from your work. But if you do good work, and you get good and you develop your craft and your skill, then you'll get praise from your works in a sense. And think about that. With this virtuous woman, people around know that this woman, she does this well. And her works actually praise her, in a sense, from the type of work that she does. Her praise comes from her children, her husband, and from her own works. I think that's a good thought. And then lastly, her superiority, the virtuous woman's superiority. And we find this in verse number, let me see here, verse number 30. Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. So the point is that this woman is better than favor, better than beauty. Her virtue is what matters, not favor and beauty. So go after, look for in a woman, look for in a wife, look for in a future wife, look for a lady that has virtue. Virtue. And again, that's a very broad thing, isn't it? It's a very broad topic. But it includes many, if not all, of these things, and then some. Look for virtue. And I know it's hard to see, you're at college and you don't, it's not like you're growing up together and you see that they're real and so on. But look for virtue if you can. Ask people, what is she really like? And no, not what does she look like. What does she act like in front of me? What is she really like? Does she have virtue? And, what is beauty? The Bible says beauty is vain. But what is beauty? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The point I'm making is, if she has virtue, and she's the type of woman that you want, she'll be beautiful. I guarantee you. To you, she'll be beautiful. So forget trying to just find the one that's beautiful. Find the one that's virtuous, because it's much better than the beauty. And I guarantee you, as you go through your life, you'll either be glad or sad. You'll be sad if you say, I must have gone after beauty because she's not very virtuous. Or you'll be glad and say, man, am I glad that I went after virtue and she's the most beautiful woman in my life. So it's your choice. Go after virtue. And again, for us, in English, it doesn't jump out at us. But in the Hebrew, this would be really neat to teach your kids all of these great jewels of, these pearls of a virtuous woman. Teach your kids that. And it's easy to remember that way because of the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet. All right, we will stop there for today.